So we'll move then to the next part. Okay. I'll move that the presentation be received. Seconded by Councillor Darby, Deputy Chair. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. So we're now on item 8. So we'll go straight to the presentation from John, and then our expert witness, Stephen, welcome. Then we're going to hear briefly from Peter Haynes and Mark, who've asked to speak, and then we'll move on to, I just want to signal I do have a recommendation from Councillor Darby and Councillor Filipaina, and so we'll be speaking to that. So.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Just waiting for the presentation to come up on the screen. All right, so I want to start by just putting up a map that shows the 87 view shafts, this sort of spatial two-dimensional extent of them in the notified plan. They're predominantly rolled over from the legacy district and regional planning documents. What you see there on the screen of the, I guess what we call the origin point of the view shaft, and normally they're a triangle heading towards the cone itself. The blue areas here are what we call the height-sensitive areas. So in terms of the unitary plan hearings panel, this topic sits under view shafts and height-sensitive areas. The two very much go hand in hand. Not all of the maunga have a height-sensitive area, but some of them do, and they're more of a sort of blanket control, whereas the view shaft is a plane, and generally in a triangle, between an origin point and the view shaft. So that's the difference between the two, and that's the coverage generally of the 87. You see the ones up to Rangitoto here, and lots within the Isthmus and Mangere Mountain there, and Mount Victoria, North Head and Mount Victoria on North Shore. So reflecting on the timeline, or just recapping on the timeline, we had the hearings commenced last May. The hearings essentially were adjourned by the panel. Interim guidance was issued by the panel that was reported back through to the committee. The panel did express some quite strong reservations about the view shafts, but the committee's decision at that point was to continue on. We then had a minute from the panel, August, which outlined the work that it required the experts representing submitters to carry out before the hearing would reconvene. All of the submitters on the view shafts were invited to put forward experts into what's called expert conferencing. We've only had this expert conferencing on a small number of unitary plan topics. Generally, we've had mediation and then a hearing, but this is a slightly unusual case. We've had a hearing that started, stopped, guidance, minute from the panel, expert conferencing, so it has been quite a complex process. That conferencing finished on Monday. Stephen Brown is our landscape architect who's been heavily involved in view shafts, as you're probably all well aware, for a couple of decades now, if not longer.
A bit longer.
A bit longer. And Stephen was in the landscape expert conferencing. There was also expert conferencing of economists, and this was all directed by the panel, not by council. And then we had expert conferencing of the planners to talk about some of the rules. The next step in the process after today is mediation on the 5th of April, and then the hearing reconvenes on the 9th of May, so that's roughly a month later. Then, of course, we get the panel recommendations in July and the council decision on view shafts and other unitary plan topics in August. So I guess the key point to stress once again is this is just another step along the way. The reason why we have brought this item to you is, first of all, when we reported the guidance to the committee in last August or September, we did say that we'd report back to you on the expert conferencing, and also there will be a strong expectation from the panel that in the mediation on the 5th of April that there is not just a view from council's experts, but there is actually a council position either aligned with the experts or potentially a different position. So in summary, it's to ensure that the council yourselves have the opportunity to hear where this expert conferencing has got to. Stephen will talk you through that. And then we can hopefully have a confirmed position for the mediation on the 5th of April. And anything coming out of the mediation could well be brought back to the committee if there's a need for that to happen before the hearings in May. just quickly before handing over to Stephen, the minute from the panel, we've missed a slide here. Apologies for that. There is a slide missing. So it's essentially from the agenda report, but the landscape architects, the economists and the planners were given a set of tasks in this minute from the panel. And I'll probably hand over to Stephen. He can talk through the landscape element of that. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you,
So
John.
we just hand that over to Stephen's presentation.
As many of you will be aware, when we last went to a hearing, we had a very large number of submitters, generally in opposition to individual view shafts, but in the case of Housing New Zealand, opposition to a significant number, in fact virtually all of the view shafts. And at that stage, the landscape evidence given on behalf of Housing New Zealand seemed to anticipate that most of the view shafts that we currently have would go, and that a small number would be retained together with some new view shafts from the individual cones to other cones. The direction from the panel was that we first of all needed to revisit and justify the view shafts that exist at present, and also to effectively establish criteria for the identification of any future view shafts. And we were also instructed to divide the view shafts into those that were considered to be regionally significant, locally significant, or not significant at all. In the course of that project, we effectively had to develop a basis for determining whether view shafts were regionally significant. The RPS policies on the view shafts state that they have to be regionally significant. And so the things that we started to look at, and I started to look at specifically, are the four matters of the four criterion or factors that are identified on the slide above, and those related to the expressiveness and the clarity of imagery associated with the individual maunga, as volcanic landmarks, as icons of Auckland's Maori and cultural history and heritage, and as components of the wider volcanic field, which is obviously quite unique on the world stage. Secondly, we had to look at connections and symbolism, the relationship of the maunga and cones to the areas around them, and indeed to the identity of the city. So I explored at some length the issue of gateways to and from the city, how the views to the cones related to those, but also the connections between individual suburbs and parts of the city and some of the individual maunga as well. So areas like Mount Eden, Devonport, Mount Wellington, or Mangere all have a very strong affinity and connection with individual maunga. We also looked at the issue of clarity of expression, just how clearly the individual cones were articulated, or groupings of them were in some views. And finally, we looked at the importance of the vantage points. And this was an area where there was considerable division, I'd have to say, in terms of early discussions. In some cases, there was a very strong emphasis upon just the motorways, just the major arterial roads. And so we've had to work our way through that issue. I also need to stress that in determining whether any view shaft and view was regionally significant, there has had to inevitably be a lot of weighing up and balancing of the values of individual views. They're not always important in all four respects, but it's important that they are significant in at least some of them. So with that in mind, I have undertaken an evaluation of 87 view shafts. That work has taken the best part of 4.5 months, and it's resulted in this tome of analyses, and it's also resulted in the realisation that we have issues with some particular views and view shafts as currently identified. And so that is essentially why we are here. Currently there are 10 view shafts which I have indicated in the course of expert conferencing that I consider to be either locally significant or not significant at all, rather than regionally significant. And at present, the other people involved in this process of evaluation would like to see another 20 view shafts removed or downgraded. And I'm opposing that and resisting it at present. But we have to then still confront those that I have effectively downgraded. And so I thought I'd just very quickly take you through those 10 that we need to look at today. So if we can turn to the first slide, I'll just go through them very quickly. I've tried to summarise some of the how each of these views relate to those 4 criteria that I've talked about. When you go back to the 1976 photos from Fowles Park to Mount Albert, in this instance dealing with view shaft A11, there were very few of the trees that you see now, and those trees are scattered right through that residential environment. If it was just a veneer of trees on the edge of the park or within the park, then I could accept that they will come and go over time. But within the body of that residential area, they are now part of the fabric of that residential area. And therefore, I have taken the longer view that most of that vegetation in this instance will remain. And as you can see, even though you can see the crown of Mount Albert in this view, it is from one very, very specific spot. It doesn't represent the views from the rest of the park. In fact, the cone is impossible to see from most of the rest of the park. And the view that you do obtain of Mount Albert is actually typical of many that can be obtained from the surrounding area. Hence the recommendation that this cannot be regarded as regionally significant. If we move on to the next slide, please. View shaft E4, originally Balmoral Road, just before it meets Green Lane Road West. Originally this was this part of the arterial road provided a very clear view to Mount Eden. It's completely perpendicular to the alignment of the roadway. And again, what has happened is that the vegetation within residential properties adjoining the roadway has risen up to the point where I had to search long and hard just to get this view. This is the only point at which you can get this view. Motorists no longer see Mount Eden as they go past this viewpoint. It's essentially one that's restricted to pedestrians and the odd cyclist going past it. And again, they have to look either sharply to the left or right to actually see it. And so even though this is an important vantage point from a regional perspective, the view offered is one that's simply too fleeting and too difficult for anybody to see for me to be able to identify it as being regionally significant. If we could move to the next slide, please. Alberton House has long had a strong sense of connection with Mount Eden, and it also has a view to, or did have a view to One Tree Hill. Unfortunately, the vegetation within the historic grounds of Alberton House is now reaching the point where very little of Mount Eden or One Tree Hill is visible. In addition, the only place that Mount Eden can be seen from is the outside veranda of the upstairs floor, and that veranda is no longer safe for people to use. So there is no public access to this viewpoint. And so even though there is the sense of connection between an area of cultural heritage significance and obviously a feature of natural heritage significance, In terms of the criteria that I've had to work through, it is extremely difficult to justify the retention of this view shaft.